Hello from the Channel studio in London and welcome to another edition of Foreign Dispatches, the programme that takes you around the world in 25 minutes. I'm Teniola Oyetayo. On the programme this week, earthquake survivors express frustration in Syria and Turkey as a possibility of finding buried victims alive fades. Plus, NATO defence ministers meet to discuss accelerated support to Ukraine ahead of anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion. Over a week since the devastating earthquake that hit Syria and Turkey, several people were miraculously rescued alive this week after being trapped for over 200 hours. But with chances of finding more survivors growing more unlikely, the focus of the aid effort has shifted to helping people now struggling without shelter or enough food in the bitter cold. In Syria and Turkey, survivors have criticised the government's response and have expressed frustration over the slow arrival of aid and support. Two women rescued alive from the rubble of a collapsed building in southeastern Turkey after being trapped for over 200 hours following the region's deadly earthquake. It's a brief moment of relief in a tragedy that has killed more than 40,000 people. Now, there's little hope in both Turkey and Syria that many more survivors will be found. Sites like this one in Gaziantep house dozens of empty graves ready for mass burials. It's now been over a week since Monday's devastating 7.8 magnitude quake, Turkey's worst since 1939. Across the devastated region, people are still awaiting news of missing loved ones. Many are also angry about the slow pace of support from officials.
This past week has been bad, really bad. We're devastated. We didn't receive aid or anything for the first 3 days. This was really painful.
In Syria, where relief efforts are complicated by more than a decade-old civil war, many feel abandoned. As of Tuesday, very little aid had entered, even after the Damascus government said on Friday it would allow convoys to cross front lines. The government of President Bashar al-Assad has blamed difficulties in rescue efforts on the impact of Western sanctions imposed on the country.
The Syrian government has repeatedly expressed its commitment to deliver humanitarian aid to Syrians wherever they are on the Syrian soil. And I also affirmed that northwest Syria is an integral part of Syrian lands and that our people there are part of the Syrian people. And Syria will not accept that they be divided based on lines drawn by terrorist armed groups. Based on that, Syria supports the entry of humanitarian aid into the region through all possible cross points, whatever from inside Syria or across the borders.
More than 6,000 people are now known to have been killed in Syria by the 6th of February earthquakes. In Turkey, the death toll has already exceeded 31,000. More than 1 million people have been left homeless in Turkey, and in Syria, aid organizations warn this number could be much higher. After visiting some of the worst affected sites, the United Nations top aid chief said the level of suffering brought by the disaster has been all too clear to see, and said he hopes to encourage greater support from the global community.
And what is the most striking here is even in Aleppo, which has suffered so much these many years, this moment, that moment, a week or more ago, was about the worst that these people have experienced. People who lost their children, some of whom escaped, others stayed in the building. The trauma of the people we spoke to was visible. And this is a trauma which the world needs to heal.
Donations and aid supplies have been slowly trickling in, but there is considerable concern surrounding the sheer scale of the humanitarian disaster, which lies ahead following the disaster. On Tuesday, the UN Secretary General launched an appeal for $397 million to help victims in Syria.
In the immediate aftermath of the earthquakes, the United Nations rapidly provided $50 million through the Central Emergency Response Fund. But the needs are immense. The Syria effort brings together the entire UN system and humanitarian partners and will help secure desperately needed life-saving relief for nearly 5 million Syrians, including shelter, healthcare, food, and protection. The most effective way to stand with the people is by providing this emergency funding. We all know that life-saving aid has not been getting in at the speed and scale needed. The scale of this disaster is one of the worst in recent memory. And I have an urgent message to the international community. The human suffering from this epic natural disaster should not be made even worse by man-made obstacles. Access, funding, supplies. Aid must get through from all sides to all sides through all routes without any restrictions.
The magnitude 7.8 quake, the deadliest in the region in decades, hit Turkey and Syria in the early hours of Monday last week, causing entire apartment blocks to crumble to dust and crushing families to death as they slept. The quake was the biggest recorded worldwide by the US Geological Survey since a tremor in the remote South Atlantic in August 2021. With thousands dead and many more injured, the World Health Organization is describing the earthquakes as the worst natural disaster in a century. At a small hospital near the Bab al-Hawa border crossing with Turkey, doctors have been working tirelessly since the quake struck last week. Neurosurgeon Mustafa al-Yamani has not left the hospital where he works in Syria's Idlib for 6 days. The small hospital near the Bab al-Hawa border crossing with Turkey is where many of the victims of last Monday's earthquakes have been taken.
هو صراحة على الصعيد الشخصي أنا يوم الزلزال كان عندي عطلة أيام العطلة.
On the day of the quake, I was on my day off, and after the disaster, there was a call put out for all doctors to head to hospitals, and I responded. I started working on Monday morning, the morning of the quake. Until now, 6 days, I've been at the hospital and worked around the clock.
According to the United Nations, more than 7 million children have been affected by the massive earthquake. The disaster has left unknown numbers of orphans across Syria and Turkey. UNICEF volunteers are helping children who lost their homes or loved ones cope with the traumatic event.
Thousands of children faced on the 6th of February a crisis within a crisis where they continue to face complex situation of displacement, of fear, and extreme cold weather. As you see that this collective shelter that used to be a school is now accommodating families that lost houses and loved ones.
In Syria, the disaster hit hardest in the rebel-held northwest, leaving homeless yet again many people who had already been displaced several times by a decade-old civil war. Compared to government areas, the region has received little aid. Doctors in a field hospital in the southern Turkish city of Istanbul are treating increasing numbers of patients suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and panic attacks after last week's devastating earthquake.
Initially, we were having a lot of trauma cases. The people were buried into the rubble for a long time, for up to 72 hours, 90 hours. There was small girl, old people. They've been taken out, rescued, and then brought to us. One person, we have to do a amputation to save his life. So initially, there were life and limb saving surgeries. Now the case profile is changing. They are in more of infectious diseases because now the upper respiratory tract infection, gastrointestinal infections have started coming in, and the chronic cases are also falling in because the government hospital is also restricted services because the building is damaged. So those patients are also coming to us.
The World Health Organization has launched a $43 million appeal to provide trauma care and rehabilitation, essential medicines, vital mental and psychological support, and to continue routine health services. As a focus of the aid efforts in Syria and Turkey shifts from the rescue of those trapped under the rubble to helping the survivors made homeless by the earthquake, officials say people will need long-term assistance. Our correspondent, Juliana Olayinka, spent some time with local aid organizations earlier this week and reports on the aid efforts in the region.
Straddling Europe and Asia across the iconic Bosphorus Strait, residents of Turkey's largest city are a few miles away from the horror their fellow citizens are enduring in the southeast. People here have their own issues to contend with, like a tanking economy and sky-high inflation, issues that have to be pushed aside for now. Istanbul has become a focal point for the hundreds of aid agencies desperate to offer support. Volunteers have left their lives from across the world and are willing to join the search and rescue missions. Those people are not courting public sympathy.
So as to be expected, it's pretty difficult to get a hold of people, but I've hopped into a taxi because I'm told that some international doctors have set up a makeshift HQ so they can get to some of the disaster zones, which is just about an hour away from this bustling city.
Fortunately, I've stumbled upon the local Doctors Worldwide headquarters. The people leading the rescue teams here are not sleeping, but the work doesn't stop.
Actually, the statistics say that there are 23 million people affected by the earthquake in the region. The area is so big, it's almost the size of France. So the numbers tell a lot about how devastating the earthquake is. As we arrived there, there were teams, research and rescue teams working on the ground with. So it's so difficult for the people who are even alive in the region because they are living outside, they are living in tents, they are living in camp cities established by AFAD, a public body. So bad actually.
Idil Alabey is a young project assistant turned mammoth project coordinator supporting senior staff.
We have thousands of volunteer doctors and medical staff here. Also, we have operational teams in there. So it's not enough. It couldn't be enough, but we are trying to reach every out.
So Istanbul may not be the epicenter of the disaster, but it's certainly become the focal point for foreign aid groups, local aid groups to get together to work, to pack essentials that people so desperately need. This room where I'm standing used to actually be a meeting room, but just have a look around me. It's turned into a place where people are sending in medicines, they're sending in clothes, they're sending in food products. We've got lots of young volunteers here working day and night to ensure that the 23 million people who are affected get the help that they so urgently need. When Foreign Dispatches returns in just a moment, New Zealand declares state of emergency after Cyclone Gabrielle hit North Island. Please stay with us. You're also watching Foreign Dispatches on Channels Television. New Zealand's Prime Minister says Cyclone Gabrielle, which has pummeled much of the North Island, is a weather event not seen in a generation. Chris Hipkins' government has declared a state of emergency, only the third in New Zealand's history. About a third of the country's population of 5 million people live in affected areas.
Roads across the north of New Zealand were submerged in floodwater after Cyclone Gabrielle lashed the region, bringing strong winds, heavy rain and huge ocean swells. The storm caused extensive flooding, landslides and damage to infrastructure, prompting the country to declare a national state of emergency. New Zealand has only previously declared a national state of emergency on 2 occasions, during the start of the COVID-19 pandemic and following the 2011 Christchurch earthquake.
What is clear is that the devastation is widespread and it's taken a toll beyond property and livelihoods to people. There have been 4 confirmed fatalities as a result of the cyclone. The grief of their families and loved ones will be unimaginable.
About 250,000 people were without power on Tuesday. Falling trees have smashed houses and landslides have carried others away and blocked roads.
This doesn't compare with anything. This is just over the top. Really, like the thunder and lightning and everything last night was just horrific. So, but the devastation is just, it just makes you want to cry, to be honest. Very upsetting.
The government has attributed the scale of the disaster to climate change, with the country's climate change minister denouncing the global lack of action.
And I have to say that as I stand here today, I struggle to find words to express what I am thinking and feeling about this particular crisis. I don't think I've ever felt as sad or as angry about the lost decades that we spent bickering and arguing about whether climate change was real or not, whether it was caused by humans or not, whether it was bad or not, whether we should do something about it or not, because it is clearly here now. And if we do not act, it will get worse. I have to say, I've been recalling actually a quote from a different time about a different crisis. The era of procrastinations, of half measures, of soothing and baffling expedients, of delays is coming to its close. In its place, we are entering a period of consequences. And there will be people who say, just as the National Rifle Association in the United States does about shootings over there, it's too soon to talk about these things, but we are standing in it right now. This is a climate change-related event. The severity of it, of course, made worse by the fact that our global temperatures have already increased by 1.1 degrees. We need to stop making excuses for inaction. We cannot put our heads in the sand when the beach is flooding. We must act now.
Cyclone Gabrielle weakened and moved away from New Zealand on Wednesday as the country started to assess the damage caused by significant flooding, landslides and high winds.
And now, with the first anniversary of Russia's invasion nearing, the Kremlin has intensified operations across southern and eastern Ukraine, and a major new offensive has been widely anticipated. This week, NATO defense ministers met in Brussels to discuss how to sustain and accelerate support for Ukraine. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg stressed the need for providing Ukraine with more ammunition and completing pledged deliveries of tanks and other heavy equipment.
Russian forces bombarded Ukrainian towns along the front lines of the eastern Donetsk region on February the 14th. As NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg warned that Russian President Vladimir Putin isn't preparing for peace, but instead for more war.
Next week we mark the first year of the terrible war in Ukraine, the full-fledged invasion by Russia against Ukraine. And we see no signs that President Putin is preparing for peace. What we see is the opposite. He is preparing for more war, for new offensives and new attacks.
His comments came as Ukraine's Western allies met at the NATO headquarters in Brussels to discuss sending more arms to Ukraine. Ukraine has been pushing for fighter jets from allies as it braces for an expected Russian offensive. Speaking to allies, the NATO chief said beyond discussions on new weapons for Kyiv, already delivered arms need to be kept working.
Putin made two big strategic mistakes. He underestimated the strength and the bravery of the people of Ukraine and its armed forces, and he underestimated the unity and resolve of NATO and partners. NATO allies are providing unprecedented support to Ukraine to help uphold its right of self-defense. And from the start, we have been working very closely with the European Union, determined to support Ukraine for as long as it takes.
NATO countries have been supplying Ukraine with ammunition from their own stocks, but supplies are dwindling, putting Western defence industries under strain. US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin said the countries that had sent arms to Ukraine will continue to do so to make sure Ukraine has what it needs to defend itself.
The Kremlin is still betting that it can wait us out, but 1 year on, we are as united as ever. And that shared resolve will help sustain Ukraine's momentum in the crucial weeks ahead and help Ukraine travel the challenging road that lies beyond. And looking around this room today, I know that our unity will only grow. We all understand the stakes in Russia's war of choice. This isn't just about Ukraine's right to live in peace and security. It's also about the kind of world that our children will inherit. None of us want to live in a world where autocrats can assault their peaceful neighbors, trample their borders, and bombard their people. So we've come together to stand up for a world where rules matter, where sovereignty is respected, and where civilians are protected.
Speaking at a later press conference, America's top general, Mark Milley, also hit out at Russia, saying it had lost the war.
NATO and this coalition has never been stronger, and Russia is now a global pariah, and the world remains inspired by Ukrainian bravery and resilience. In short, Russia has lost. They've lost strategically, operationally, and tactically, and they are paying an enormous price on the battlefield.
Russia has condemned the meeting, accusing NATO of being hostile towards Moscow and becoming more and more involved in the conflict. With the first anniversary of the invasion nearing, the Kremlin has intensified operations across southern and eastern Ukraine as it prepares for an anticipated big new offensive. Meanwhile, the United Nations has made an appeal to raise $5.6 billion to support the Ukrainians most affected by the Russian invasion.
More than 7,000 civilians have been killed in Ukraine, according to our estimates, in the last year. Almost certainly a low estimate. 12,000 civilians have been injured, again, according to our estimates, and no doubt a low estimate. Hundreds of children, of course, shockingly among those numbers.
The refugee component of what we launched today is $1.7 billion for this year. It is very complementary to what is being done. That's why we're launching the two appeals together. It concerns 10 countries. The Ukraine refugee crisis, displacement crisis, remains the largest in the world, clearly. It's almost 6 million estimated internally displaced people, plus, the refugees in Europe who have registered for temporary protection are close to 5 million now, 4.8 million. But we know that there's many more that have not. So the scale of displacement is continues to be quite massive.
With no end in sight to the fighting in Ukraine, the United Nations says the funds are to support more than 11 million Ukrainians to provide them with food, healthcare, cash, and other necessary assistance.
And that's the programme today. But remember, our top stories are never far away. You can catch them on channelstv.com. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Tenyola Uyitayo. Bye for now.